Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Jewish History. I'm delighted that you're all here for this month's Family History Today lecture, Researching Your LGBTQ plus Ancestors. So, my name is Moria Amit, and I'm the Genealogy Institute Manager here at the Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute, filling in tonight for Jenny Rappaport, who couldn't be here. I just have a few short remarks before I introduce today's speaker. First of all, the Center for Jewish History provides a collaborative home for 5 in-house partner organizations, which together form the largest archive on the modern Jewish experience outside of Israel. In addition, the center houses the Ackman and Ziff Family Genealogy Institute, where we assist people, whether Jewish or non-Jewish, with researching their family history. Because time is of the essence, the Genealogy Institute has recently shifted our focus to helping Holocaust survivors and their direct descendants, in the hope that solving questions about their families can bring healing and closure. Our definition of a Holocaust survivor is quite broad and encompasses anyone who experienced persecution under the Nazi regime from 1933 to 1945, regardless of religion, including refugees, people in hiding, and those who were incarcerated in concentration camps. If you are a Holocaust survivor or the direct descendant of a Holocaust survivor, we encourage you to make an appointment with us by emailing gia@cjh.org, which I will also note in the chat shortly. We remain open to the general public on Mondays from 9:30 a.m. to 4:30 p.m., when our experienced genealogy staff is happy to assist researchers of all levels of experience with their research. Again, this is for Mondays, this is regardless of whether you are a survivor, descendant of a survivor. It can be anyone. And no appointments are needed on Mondays. Um, uh, uh, Please just walk in whenever we're open, and there will be somebody here who can assist you. Any questions and comments during this program can be submitted at any time by using the Q&A box on the bottom of your screen. Please note that our guest speaker will answer the vast majority of your questions during the dedicated Q&A portion at the end of this program. If you'd like to view the closed captions for this program, please click on the closed caption button on the bottom of your screen and then click Show Subtitles. This program will be recorded. Please note, however, that it takes some time to correct the auto captions for the program, which we do for every video. So once the video is online, you'll receive an email with the link to watch it. And finally, the moment we've been waiting for, I'm thrilled to introduce today's speaker, Michael J. Leclerc. Michael is a popular genealogical presenter, teacher, author, and editor around the world. For more than a decade, he has been a facilitator and instructor in Boston University's very well-regarded, I might add, Genealogy Studies program, where he currently teaches research and writing skills. He has edited a number of books, including Genealogical Writing in the 21st Century, A Guide to Register Style and More, with Henry Hoff, and the 5th edition of Genealogist Handbook for New England Research. He is a contributing editor for American Ancestors magazine and a consulting editor for the New England Historical and Genealogical Register. And he's the former managing editor of the Association of Professional Genealogists Quarterly. With that, I'm very pleased to welcome Michael to our series, and Michael, feel free to take it away from here.
Thanks so much.
You're welcome.
Just so I don't get in trouble, I just want to clarify, I'm also the former contributing editor and consulting editor. Just in case there's somebody here who knows the folks at any HDS, I don't want to get in trouble. Well, welcome. It's lovely to be here with you all. Looking forward to, pardon me, sharing about researching our LGBTQ ancestors, because I promise you we all have them, whether we realize it or not, we do. And it's interesting how when I grew up, I always felt like I was the only one in my family. And as I've gotten older and done more research on the ancestors, And there are more descendants in the family. I am definitely not the only one. Um, so we'll talk a little bit today about things to look for as you're researching, and just history in general, so you'll understand how our queer history. And by the way, I use that word queer um, because I am. So it's easy for me to use it. But for those of you who are not part of the LGBTQ community, you want to be careful about it. It's a rough road, and I do feel I am sorry for that. Um, but it is tough. But I always tell people use the word that is being used in context. So, for example, today, if any of you uses queer history, will not be considered a pejorative, and you'll be fine. So, I am going to, with that said, share my screen, and hopefully, I can do this without. Oh, hang on one second. Share screen and boom. Um. So, why is this? Okay. For some reason it's not moving, so we'll just do it this way. So, nowadays we use the terms LGBTQ, the alphabet mafia, as we call ourselves. Um, when I first came out, there were two letters. There was the gays and the lesbians. And then bisexuals were added. And then in the 1980s, the gays and the lesbians switched position in our acronym for a very important reason. During the 1980s, when the AIDS epidemic was running rampant and we were dying all over the place, the one group of people who were there for us gay men were the lesbians. And so a conscious decision was made from that point forward. We would always put the lesbians first. Um, and so you might see LGBTQIA. There's lots of acronyms now. Um, my only advice is do your best. It's hard for me to keep up. Um, but the terms LGBTQIA, the terms lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, these are a 20th century form of identification. So it's important to realize, since as genealogists, we're looking at a long period of time, going back not only decades, but possibly centuries. Um, at this point, easily covering people who lived in the 20th century and the 19th century and possibly the 18th century. So during that course of time, the identification changed. Um, until the mid 19th century, same sex relations were considered activity based. So, in other words, it wasn't an identity, it was a man who slept with a man, a woman who slept with a woman, etc. So it wasn't an identity until the mid 19th century. Um, the term, some terms like buggerer or buggery or sodomite and sodomy, bugger and buggery, you may have heard before, and that dates back to the early 1500s. Uh, sodomy and sodomites, actually, although has biblical origins, wasn't really used until about the same period. Um, to reference mostly gay men. The word lesbian dates back to 1591, and it comes from a group of women who lived together without men on the island of Lesbos in the Mediterranean. And so that term has been around almost as long. The 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 queer identity, identify as an identity, being LGBTQ as an identity as opposed to an action, doesn't happen until the 19th century. The word homosexual first occurred in 1868. So before then, No such thing as a homosexual. They wouldn't know what you were talking about. Man named Karl Maria Kurtbenny, a German, is credited. He is the first person to use the words homosexual and heterosexual. He coined them in 1868. And thus it has been ever since, although we have obviously added to the homosexual community. Other words and terminology that you might run into as you are researching. Um, Words like flaming or flamboyant. French, as you might have run into in your research, was used frequently in many countries as a language for records. Um, and the word folle was the word for gay in French. Inverts, poufs or poufters, Uranians, and earnings. These are all words that were used to describe mostly gay men, but lesbian women, what we would today call lesbian women as well. Excuse me. Um, in the 20th century, we got lots of nicknames. Um, there was Mary and Nancy and Nellie and Pansy and Queen. A lot of these come from um, a gay language that was developed in Britain in the late 19th and early 20th century. They were used. But when you're seeing references to people in records, in letters, you might find a letter and you might find a reference to Mary. If all the other people mentioned in the letter are male and you just come across Mary, don't assume it's a woman. This could be a reference to another man, and they're just referring to him as Mary. Even today, I'm sure many of you have heard on television, in the movies, etc., you've heard one gay man call another man Mary. Um, and of course, there's also the inimitable, well-known friend of Dorothy, which many people think came about in 1939, that we were friends of Dorothy Gale from The Wizard of Oz. And while everyone, all the gay men loved and adored Judy Garland, and she adored us, it dates back earlier than that to a woman named Dorothy Parker. And she was an author, if you don't know, and she had her little circle of friends, many of whom were gay men. And she would often have parties, private parties, so that gay men could come and be themselves, and lesbian women too, etc. And and the way you got access to the party was to go to the door and knock, and you had to give them the password, which was to tell them you were a friend of Dorothy. So that dates back a little bit earlier than the movie reference. But again, these are things you can find. You won't find them obviously in an official record, but in private letters, correspondence, diaries. When we're researching, it's important to retrain our brains not to assume that what we're seeing is what we think we're seeing. Pardon me. As genealogists, we should be used to that anyways, because as we all know, the meaning of words changes over time. Even the word gay means one thing now, and it means something completely different. In 1920, it meant something completely different to people. So when you watch movies back then, you see them throwing the word gay all around, and it just meant happy. Um,
Michael, a quick interruption. Where does the term Uranian originate? Somebody
oh,
asked.
I forget. It's a scientific one. Um, I'm sorry, I can't remember off the top of my head which one of the. It's a 19th century
Yeah, it's one of the 19th century
logical definitions.
terms. Yeah.
Uranian and earning both. They were, if I remember correctly, they were about the same time.
Hmm.
And that was before, if I remember correctly, it was before they predate the homosexual and heterosexual. I want to say it was the 1840s, but I don't trust
Okay. That's okay.
year. I'm sorry, I don't have the specific reference. But if you actually, if you Google it and research, you probably be able to figure it out. That's an excellent question, by the way. Thank you for asking. Whoever asked that, I appreciate it. Um, so this man is a Jewish man named Magnus Hirschfeld. And this man is, in my mind, almost single-handedly responsible for a lot of what we knew and know about what we today call LGBTQ people. Born in the mid 19th century in Germany, um, he created one of the largest collections of published material, scientific and otherwise, about what we today call LGBTQ people. Um, Unfortunately, he founded an institute for the study of I forget what it was originally. It might have even originally been called inverts. That's how old it was. Um, but unfortunately, it was located in Berlin, Germany, and he reached his zenith during the Weimar Republic. And unfortunately, when Hitler came to power, one of the first things he did was order everything in the institute destroyed, and Magnus was persecuted and eventually killed. Um, I unfortunately can't, again, I can't remember off the top of my head. I should have refreshed my memory about how he came to his end. But yeah, definitely Hitler was definitely not a fan. So we lost a lot of material. But because he had created the Institute, because he had done all the work that he had, other countries had also, and many places, especially universities, started some collections of materials. And so we today know how much we do know about the history of LGBTQ people because of the work this man did and his influence on the academic community and the scientific community on studying LGBTQ people. Um, and I'll leave that at that. Um, this is an interesting book for me. There's lots has been published in the last like 30 or 40 years, studying earlier history. Uh, and This book by Noel Malcolm, Forbidden Desire in Early Modern Europe, Male-Male Sexual Relations from 1400 to 1750, uh, is an excellent study that helps for those of you who are more interested in the history of these folks. And for those of you who may be LGBTQ in the audience, I'm sure we've got a few. This is an excellent book. Um, Although it's not a small book, it's like this big. So it's not a Saturday afternoon read, but there's a lot of great information in there. And um, it tells there are references in there to early Jewish poets in from a millennia ago, from the year 1000. Um, One of whom was Yishak ben Marsal, and he wrote, "Lovely of eyes like David, he has slain me like Uriah. He has inflamed my passions and consumed my heart with fire." Obviously, we know exactly what he's talking about. Moses Ezra, who was born in 1055, wrote, "Night and day I was only with him. I undressed him and he undressed me. I sucked his lips and he sucked mine." Obviously, he was making out with some dude and doing more. Um, but this just goes to show that we have always been around. You know, we hear a lot about ancient Greece, and then it seems the gays in ancient Greece, and then we jump up to like Stonewall in 1968. There's a lot in between. And as you're looking at history, remember you can use understanding the history of what things were like for LGBTQ people in different periods of time will help you as you're researching understand the clues you may look for and find in your research about your ancestor. So one of the biggest problems we have as LGBTQ people is people attempting to write us out of history. Um, and, you know, I mentioned Hitler's destruction of all the research Hirschfeld had done with his institute. Um, but even today, people try to write us out of history. This is a contemporary example, actually, from the 80s. Um, this is an obituary for James W. Smith of Austin, Texas, who died on May 9th, 1988. The obituary said he died of following a brief illness. This wasn't was this the obituary? Yeah, he died following a brief illness. Those of you of a certain age, knowing that a single man, well, he in 1988 died of a illness, will know exactly what he died of. He died of AIDS. In the Austin paper, the obituary said he's survived by his parents, Mayor James W. Smith Sr. and Helen of Lone Star, Texas, brothers and sisters-in-law, Mark and Pam Smith of Linden, Texas, and Charles and Denise Smith of Dangerfield, Texas, nephew Christopher James Smith, and nieces Lindy K. Smith and Megan Smith, maternal grandmother Alta Oneth of McAllister, Oklahoma, and paternal grandmother Genevieve Smith of Fontana, California. Jim is also survived by his partner, Dr. Tony Elam. That's the obituary that ran in Austin, where Tony was allowed to write the obituary for the newspaper. This is in the uh, the Star, I think it was. It's the big newspaper in Texas even today. However, there was also an obituary published in his hometown, which said survivors include his parents, Mayor and Mrs. James W. Smith of Lone Star, brothers and sisters-in-law, Mark and Pam of Linden, Chris and Denise of Dangerfield, grandmothers, uh, um, uh, Oneth McAllister and Genevieve Smith of Montana, a nephew and two nieces. There's absolutely no mention of his longtime partner. They were together for, I believe, if I remember correctly, almost 20 years when Jim died. Um, and when um, when Tony died, they were not allowed to be buried together. The family took Jim back home and buried him in their family plot and specifically barred Tony from being buried with them. They did everything they could to uh, erase the relationship from history. But it's a good example of how, when researching our LGBTQ ancestors, we can't just rely on one record. We have to look at multiple records because very frequently some of it was whitewashed to hide things. And so we need to look at multiple sources to make sure we're getting the full picture, as much information as possible. Um, This is for those interested in the early American period. Again, another thing to show, we look at the transgender people as if they just happened around today. But absolutely no, there was a case of a man, woman, or a person, I should say, uh, Thomas or Thomasine Hall. They were born about 1600 as Thomasine and sent to London in 1612 to live with their aunt. In 1624, their brother was drafted into the British Army. They went with him as Thomas and went into the army. They served for 1 year and returned home and lived again as Thomasine. In 1627, they went to Virginia as Thomas and went as a service to a man named John Tyros. But once there, they began dressing as a woman again. There was obviously, as you can imagine, controversy with some people in the community, and they were examined and found to be intersex, which means there was disagreement as to which genitalia they had. They were brought before the quarterly court in Virginia, and in 1629 they told their story to the judges of the quarter court. The court was 100% convinced of their honesty. And the governor announced that they were both man and woman. and they would be required from then on to wear the clothing of both. They were to wear the breeches and shirt of a man, but the cap and apron of a woman at all times. So that was in 1629, 400 years ago. There's nothing new under the sun. And there's evidence of even transgender folks to be found. All you got to do is go looking for them. One of the great places, of course, is court records. In early times, in the 18th and 19th centuries, people were frequently subject to arrest for their activities. Again, it wasn't an identity back then; it was just their activities, and so um, court records are really important, really important resource to look at. Um, Another thing to do is to look at the family, look at the people around them. In my family, this is my mother's family. They were my grandparents, Eddie and Yvette, and then there was my mom and her sister and their brother. And Uncle Ray has a grandson who is gay. He's actually a bartender at the local gay bar in Boston that I go to all the time. Um, the sister has a grandson who is also gay and about to marry his boyfriend, his long-term boyfriend. And my mother, of course, has me. So far, I'm the only one in my immediate family. No, I'm not actually. Um, I have a niece who hasn't yet used the word, but she does have a girlfriend that she's been living with for many years. So look around at the family and look for evidence of others. Um, that's coming forward in time, going backwards in time, and I'll come back to talk about these two folks. But for right now, there's Monokelwa, my mother's uncle, right? No, my mother's great uncle, and Uncle Arthur, um, who was my father's mother's brother, my father's uncle. Um, when you're looking at families, you want to look for the patterns. For example, um, the Lavender family, these are two of the brothers are two of my best friends in the world. And there were four sons, two of them were gay. There was one great uncle who married but never had any children. This is another sign. When you're looking at people who get married, whether it's younger in life or later in life, when they get married and they don't have children, kind of a warning sign. This can be what we call a lavender marriage. These were very popular in Hollywood in the up through the 1970s. Cary Grant. Um, um, oh my God, who's the other one? Okay, I'm gonna not think of it. Um, the one who lived with his boyfriend. No, it was Cary Grant, yeah, who lived with his boyfriend for 16 years, who was also an actor, and then finally in the 60s married Diane Cannon so he could prove he wasn't gay. Um, um, uh, but anyways, lavender marriages are a marriage between a man and a woman designed to hide the fact that either one or both of them are gay. And so when you find a family when you see a family where everybody in the family has children and there's one couple that doesn't, it's a warning sign. It's not definitive proof. For example, my mother, uh, my um, my mother's mother, her brother-in-law, my great aunt's husband, fought during World War II, and he was taken a prisoner of war uh, during the war. There was a he and his unit were in a farmhouse, and he ordered them all out the back door while he stayed behind to fend off the German soldiers so they could all escape, which they did all escape, but he was captured and spent the rest of the war in a prison camp. Um, so he never talked about his experiences there, and we don't know what happened. But we do know they were never able to have children, and we're all pretty convinced it was because of whatever happened to him in the prison camp. Um, so there can be other reasons, but usually when there are other reasons, there's usually evidence of it somewhere. Um, so there was also in this family another great aunt and two great uncles who never married. And the great aunt, there are reasons like we don't want to um we don't want to rely on stereotypes, but stereotypes are stereotypes. I mean, they're often inaccurate, but there's a reason why stereotypes exist. And so they can be used as clues in your research. For example, the, the great aunt, Aunt Margaret, Aunt Margareta, actually, because her father was from Spain. Anyways, the great aunt was a librarian, never married, only hung around with her female friends, and her favorite activity was working on cars with her fellow female friends and go auto racing. This was in the 40s, 50s, and 60s into the early 70s. You know, we have the saying, if it walks like a duck and it quacks like a duck, it's probably a duck. Um, and the same with the two great uncles. They're similar. They never married. They hung around with a lot of guys. One of them left the family and didn't associate much with them. These are all signs to look for. Um, and again, nothing individually is necessarily conclusive proof, but you want to keep building evidence and doing lots of research and putting together the clues so you can come to a reasonable conclusion. So, for those of you who don't know this or haven't seen this silhouette before, um, these are two ladies named Charity Bryant and Sylvia Drake. Um, they met in Weybridge, Vermont in 1807 when Charity went up there to visit a friend. They quickly moved in together and started a tailoring business together. And they lived together as a married couple, and they never spent a day apart until Charity died 44 years later. In fact, there they are living together in the 1850 census. The entire town knew who they were and treated them as a couple. They had no problem with it. There's a stereotype that everybody always hated LGBTQ people, and that's an exaggerated stereotype. Um, Many of them, I'm sure, maybe didn't necessarily approve of it, but they were friendly. They were well respected. They were a well-respected couple in the community. Fellow businessmen came and talked to Charity about because she was the one who was the business person behind everything. Um, and they asked her advice. They helped her build she helped them build their businesses. Um, and again, everybody knew. And in fact, there's a poem that was written about them. If I were permitted to draw the veil of private life, I would briefly give you the singular and to me interesting story of two maiden ladies who dwell in this valley. I would tell you of how, in their youthful days, they took each other as companions for life, and how this union, no less sacred to them than the tie of marriage, has subsisted in uninterrupted harmony for more than 40 years. And that was written by the very well-known poet William Cullen Bryant, who was Charity's nephew. He knew them his entire life, never treated them as anything but a married couple. And in fact, when they died, unlike Jim and Tony, in the mid 19th century, they were buried together under a single stone in the town cemetery. So sometimes that evidence is right there to be seen unequivocally. Now, we don't always have a famous poet in the family, so we might not have poems that spell it out for us. But there are other writings, diaries, people's diaries. Pardon me. I think one of the most underutilized resources we have in genealogy is diaries. People don't look at them because they're not indexed, they're not easy to find, and you've got to go digging, and you've literally got to sit there. And some of these things are hundreds of pages long, and you're just reading through. The sun came out today. It was 90 degrees today, but mixed in there is often a clue, um, a piece of evidence that tells you about the family that you won't find in any other record. And diaries, you may find it in letters, but the big difference between diaries and letters is that people are more willing to be honest in a diary than they are in a letter, because in a letter, they know somebody else is going to read it. So they may be more vague, talk in circles, things like that, because they know somebody else or multiple other people are going to read this. Whereas in a diary, they assume it's just for them. And so that nobody else is going to read it, at least until after they're dead. Um, but so they are more willing frequently to be honest in a diary. That said, if they think their diary is going to be written by somebody, I mean, is going to be read by somebody else, again, when they're writing, they may be a little more circumspect, um, because they're afraid that if somebody found the diary, if they were too explicit, they'd be in trouble. So even diaries, you got to be careful. You're more likely to find something more concrete there, but you're at least equally as likely to find hidden words, that meanings in the writing that you've got to sift through to figure out what it's really saying, what the true story is. So, um, another thing to look for are stereotypical careers. For example, I talked about Monogawa. Um, this was my grandfather's uncle. Uh, he was one of the younger sons of a family of French Canadian immigrants came from Quebec they came in about 1890, came down to Connecticut. All the siblings got married, all the siblings had children. Monogawa was in his mid 30s, which for a young French Canadian Catholic man, it's unheard of to not be married at that age. Um, he he spent some time living with the family, and oftentimes, though, he was living with roommates. Oftentimes, he was working a few towns away, not in the same town where his family lived. And so, another sign that he's living close enough he can go visit, but far enough that they can't just they're not going to surprise him at the door someday. Um, and anyways, Monogawa ended up joining the army um, during World War One, but he was a volunteer. He wasn't conscripted. He wasn't drafted because he was too old. Remember, I said he was in his mid 30s. World War One was mostly young men between 18 and 24 were the ones who were drafted. Um, because it was not a war as big. It wasn't like World War II. World War One wasn't as big, and we got into the war very, very late. The Americans think World War One started in 1917. It actually started in 1914, I think it was. Um, it had been going on for a while. Um, so fewer of our men were involved. But Elwa, unfortunately, was killed in action, and I still haven't figured out how. I got to get down to the National Archives and do research about that. But the fact that he was in his mid 30s, the army is a perfect place to go because nobody questions why a soldier isn't married. I mean, many soldiers are married, but many times they're not because they say, oh, I'm out fighting. I'm going to be in the army. I'm going to be going here, there, and everywhere. It's not fair to the family. Da da da. Nobody questions why somebody who's in the army or in any branch of the military, actually, not just the army, um, the army, the navy, the Marines, whatever. Nobody questions them when they're not married. And so it's a great place to blend in. And because all the gay people knew that, men and women, they all came together. And so you would find lots of other people just like you. Um, and so it was a great place to be able to be yourself with others. Um, then there's Uncle Arthur. Every time, I wish I could have met this man, but he died about 10 years before I was born. Because all I ever think of is I have this vision in my head of Paul Lynde in Bewitched, playing Uncle Arthur, and I have the feeling that's what this dude was like. He seemed to be a very happy-go-lucky man. Um, he was very he lived life for himself. He did not. Again, he stayed with the family for a while, but pardon me, he left. That's when he was in his 20s. He left the family. They were all the whole family was living in Central Falls, Rhode Island, uh, and the the family stayed there. He left and went to Boston. Now, again, for a French Canadian Catholic family to have somebody who went that far away, it's red flag central. He left and he spent the rest of his life in Boston. Um, he would occasionally come down to visit the family. Um, and I finally found him up in Boston when I've been doing research for a while. And I'm putting two and two together. He also had a very stereotypical occupation. He worked in uh, restaurants and bars and social clubs. So I'm like, okay, never married, restaurants, bars, and social clubs in Boston and lived in the gay district. I'm like, okay, clearly I know. But also, this was my grandmother's brother. I'm like, I know my family well enough to know I can't ask direct questions. But I also knew my grandmother would never lie to me. So there were several occasions where I would say something and I knew that if she told me the reason or answered the question directly, I would know that was the answer. But if she obfuscated, I would also know that my suspicions were probably true. And um, my plan was to ask her a question so I could get the answer. And so one day I'm visiting with, and you can use this trick too sometimes with your older family members. We were visiting. This was before I had come out to anybody in my family. Not that they didn't all know, but so I'm sitting in the kitchen with my grandparents and a couple of aunts and uncles and my father, who is not the most enlightened man in the world. Um, and I said, "Oh, Meme, I found Uncle Arthur." And I found, and he lived in Boston, and here's where he lived, and he worked in the bar, and he worked in this restaurant, da 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 da. And my father turned to his mother and said, "Your brother was a fag." And I will never, to the end of my days, forget. My grandmother looked straight at me. She looked at him and she said, "Well, when we had him in my day too." I went, okay, so clearly Meme knows about me, and that answers the question about Uncle Arthur. So sometimes people will answer questions for you, but they might not do it directly. Sometimes, pardon me, sometimes you have to just take your chances, ask the questions, and wait to see what responses are. But don't ask direct questions. If I said to her, was he gay? Um, I nothing, I wouldn't have gotten an answer. Should have obfuscated. Um, but I didn't even have to say, did he ever mention any girlfriends? Because she was right there. So, yeah, talking to family members is very helpful, but sometimes you've just got to be a little cagey in how you conduct your question asking. Another clue is and this is kind of wrong. It's not adult activities and what we're thinking about. What I mean by this is activities we do as adults, like social activities. Um, for example, this is the great aunt of a very dear friend of mine, Molly Celine. She was Malka Celine, but went by Molly once she immigrated to the States with her family. She's born in Kiev, Russia, and came here in 1913. Um, she, however, was a woman who did her own thing from the moment she arrived here, and from the family stories, probably a bit before. Um, the family came into the port of New York, but quickly moved up to Buffalo, and they lived up there in Buffalo for a long time, except for Molly. Molly said, "No, no, I'm staying here." This is a photograph, by the way. On the left is Molly, and on the right is Molly with her parents in Kiev before they left. So this is her birth record in Kiev. She arrives in 1913 from Hamburg. Um, and this is Molly when she's a little bit older, and she became a suffragist. And not only was she a suffragist, she was a registered socialist. And she never, to the knowledge of any person now living, ever dated a man. Um, she was, however, frequently surrounded by female friends, frequently one at a time. Uh, so, this, for example, is a photograph of Molly with one of her female friends. Um, so it's look for things like that. Look for women, especially suffragists who are single. Many of the single female suffragists were lesbians and were involved in relationships with other women. Many of them are documented, some of them are not, but again, it's a clue to look for. So look at, are they doing these stereotypical things that LGBTQ people would be involved with? Um, Teaching is another place where men and women could hide, because originally in the 19th century, men were the teachers, and then women became teachers a little later on. Um, so um, always be on the lookout. Another place to look are the newspapers. Um, Talked before about court records. Newspapers can be a great way to find court records because even today, there are reporters, newspaper and television reporters, whose sole job is to sit in the courthouses and look to see what comes up on the agendas of the judges every single day and write stories about them. Here's an example from Boston. James A. Snow, a young man who failed to put in an appearance for sentence after conviction of the crime, was arrested in State Street, Boston on Saturday afternoon by State Policeman Pinkham. We find out a little later on that he was pardoned by the governor and council, including James A. Snow of Chelsea, who was sentenced in March 1873 to the state prison for 3 years for sodomy. So it was very clear, very, very clear that they what he went to prison for. Um, he let's see. Then we have Charles Clark. Uh, who was charged with attempted sodomy. Um, then we have bigger stings were often held. Raids where large groups of men were arrested. Here's an example from Florida where 39 men were arrested on Morals case. Morals case was the code word for gay bars. Um, uh, so then going on to read the entire thing, the total arrests, including 21 men, picked up since the grand jury indicted 64 men for sex crimes last week. So that was just a week ago. The other 18 were arrested prior to the grand jury investigation. But that also shows you that that's only 21 out of the 64 men were arrested in this action. What that should tell you is keep looking to find out what happened to the other 43. Did they get them? Did they not get them? There's probably more stings and they're getting more people over the next week or two. There'll be more people. So um, be prepared when you're searching newspaper databases. These kinds of surprises come up all the time. Uh, but you can use these as a clue. Okay, so here from this, we know that not only were they arrested and brought to court, so there's a court proceeding and on the date of this arrest, there's also a grand jury investigation, which means there'll be grand jury records. So all of these records are going to be at the courthouse. Um, look for all different kinds of court records. Remember that we tend to think of court records as people going to trial, which is awesome. We forget that there are other kinds of records as well. For example, there's the grand jury records, which are usually kept separate from the ones we normally use. So you want to look for records of the grand juries. Remember that sometimes there may be records of grand jury investigations um, or grand jury trials, not only in the courthouse, but if they survive with um, the attorneys general, or whatever it's called in that location, depending on the level of the court, they're the ones who bring the charges to the grand jury to determine if there's enough evidence to actually go arrest these people. So there can be records either place. Um, and of course, not only are there court records, but prison records. When people get arrested and they get convicted and they get sentenced, they go to prison. So there can be prison records that can help give you more information about your ancestor. Um, Again, newspapers sometimes can give you information where you least expect it. This was a case of Caroline Hall. Again, another transgender person, what we would today call either a lesbian or a transgender person. Uh, the headline read, "He was a woman." Caroline had gone to Europe as a woman, but decided to start living as a man while she was over there. She was the daughter of a very famous and wealthy Boston man, and she died her father. The reason those of you might recognize the Massachusetts State House and our Golden Dome. Her father actually designed the Golden Dome, um, and uh, so she, as a man, married another woman, and they came home. And while their ship got delayed in New York Harbor when they came back, and while the ship was in the harbor, she died. And when the doctor looked at the body, they realized all of a sudden this is not a genetic man. So there are all kinds of stories like this in the papers you might find about your ancestors, especially when it's people who live. Here's that was Miss Hall before she adopted the male attire, and you can see how with facial construction like that, she probably could easily have passed for a man. Um, and then one last thing I want to mention about transgender folk, um, because this is coming more and more into all of our lives as more and more folks are comfortable living their lives as who they are. Um, then we're going to find more and more of this in our family histories. And how do we address this? Um, the first thing I will tell you is that there are no circumstances under which it is okay for you to write about a transgender person without their permission. None. A living transgender person. There is no circumstance under which that is acceptable. You must talk to the transgender person. Um, there's a thing, for those of you who are unfamiliar, called dead naming. For transgender people, um, the process they have to go through psychologically, medically, everything to become who they really are is a very, very difficult process. And for most of them, they they are actually two different people. There is a person who was born and lived to a certain point, and then that person died. They're gone, they're dead, they are no longer on this planet. And there's a new person. The person and their original name that's referred to as their dead name. Never, ever, under any circumstances, is it okay to use a transgender person's dead name without their permission. Never. It's not acceptable. Um, and You must have a conversation with them and be honest with them. I've had many conversations with many transgender people as a genealogist, um, explaining to them, and I'm doing my best to educate them on the problem for genealogists, because I get and understand that that original person is dead and no longer exists. But from a genealogical perspective, that person left records, and we as genealogists have them. We have to deal with them. And then all of a sudden, this new person appears. There's a birth record for this person, even though a smart genealogist will see that the birth record was issued years after the birth took place, and so that should be a red flag. But still, we don't discuss any of this without talking to the transgender person, explain to them, and ask them what is the best way for you to write about their life so that people will know and understand and do what they say. I don't care how uncomfortable you are with it. If you are that uncomfortable with it, you are not the person to write that family's genealogy. Period. End of discussion. I know that may sound harsh, but this is people's lives. And just so you understand, if you use dead names and other information about living people without their permission, you could get into legal trouble for doing that. And you don't want to do that. We don't want to do that. As genealogists, we just want to make sure we document the family properly. So take your time and talk to the folks. Get to know them. Don't go in with any assumptions. Just listen to them, and then try and communicate with them. Expect that it will take a while, but you'll get there in the end. So with that, I am going to close the presentation and stop sharing my screen, and I will be happy to answer any questions you might have had.
1 second. Oh, there we go. Okay, I'm back.
Hello.
So, feel free to continue sending us your questions. I will read our first question here from Angela Bell. Are there certain phrases or terminology in court records to look for?
It depends on the time. It's a good question. It depends on the time period. Sometimes you'll see sodomy, sometimes you'll see buggery. Even into the 20th century, you can see those outmoded terms, and that's mostly because even in the court records, they're trying to be appropriate. in their language. Um, but frequently it's very direct. You know, if you are reading about two men who were arrested for vagrancy in the woods behind a bar, it's like, okay, we know what the two men were doing behind the woods behind the bar. So a lot of times we have to kind of look, if that makes sense. There's no
Hmm.
one specific legal term that was used universally.
Are there any other like coded terms that were used?
There's so many of them. There's many, 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 many.
Hmm.
Uh, I'm trying to think of a resource. That's the problem. There's no one resource to find a lot of these things. But I will say this, there are a lot of LGBTQ historical societies out there now,
Oh, that's interesting.
and they are a great resource for you to help get more of those terminology, especially his LGBTQ historical group in the location where you're researching your family, because
Hmm.
they'll know the colloquial term, because there's all kinds of localisms that we don't necessarily know, or that
Hmm.
one thing in one place, they mean one thing in New York and mean something else completely in Boston. So going there is a great place to go, and they'll have lots of reasons because there are a bunch of different resources
So
about.
these societies are at for specific geographic locations,
Yes,
or
trying to think. Hang on. I know there's one in New York. I just have to find it. Hang on. I know there's a huge collection at the library. Okay, here we go. Yeah, there's the New York City LGBT Historic Sites Project, the American LGBTQ Museum. Um, there's a lot of places in New York City.
Mhm.
And in New York State. The State Museum has an LGBTQ collection.
Okay.
Um, so there's lots of places. I suggest go to the place where, well, not physically, but you know what I mean. Like look at the location where your family was.
Hmm.
The like, New York City, great, but were they in Brooklyn? Were they on Staten Island? Were they in Manhattan? Look
Yeah.
at the specific location. I don't need to tell you all that. You know that. You're New Yorkers.
But there are some societies outside of New York as well.
Oh yeah, yeah, yeah. That like in fact Boston is celebrating. Normally I'd be there tonight.
Oh,
Uh,
okay.
their annual gala and awards show presentation thing, and they're actually honoring because it's 50 years old this year. So they're honoring the founders.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, you'll find a lot of places. You'll find they were founded in the early 70s, in the early 80s,
Hmm.
and in the early 90s. Um,
Okay.
Not continually. I mean, I literally mean you'll find clumps of them in those periods,
Hmm.
um, because it was all about Stonewall, and then it was the 10th anniversary of Stonewall and the beginning of AIDS, and then AIDS was really hitting at its peak in the early 90s.
Hmm.
So there was a lot of movement to document folks. Um, and speaking of AIDS, I didn't even cover this, but another thing to look for is when you see an obituary for a young man who died in the 80s and 90s, and they're very cagey about what he died of. You see the term brief illness or something like that, or you might even see sometimes they put it out there, but you would have to know, like if they say he died of cancer, Kaposi sarcoma, it's like, well, yeah, okay, we know what that means. He died. He was gay,
Hmm.
but they don't want to say it. And the other term they used all the time was his longtime companion. Uh,
Oh, right. Yeah.
which because they couldn't say boyfriend or husband or whatever, so they
Hmm.
would say that. Um, but when you see clues like that, or when you suspect, I recommend you go to the AIDS quilt, AIDS Memorial Quilt, which is now online, and you can look for their name,
Oh, okay.
and that would, of course, even help you confirm.
That's good to know.
Or
Thank you.
even if you've just got a young person who disappears in the 80s or early 90s, and they
Hmm.
disappear, a lot of times they died and there's no obit or only a teeny little death notice that you won't find.
Hmm.
Go over there if you suspect they might have been gay. Go to the website and check. You might find them there.
Angela Bell has another question. Are you seeing more changing of headstones for transgender community for the transgender community these days?
Um,
Um,
I would say no, not changing of headstones because most people's names don't go on a headstone until after they're dead. And at that
mhm.
point, the change is already.
Okay.
Um, but I would say if there are some people like my name is on a headstone, I don't even know if I'm going to be buried there, but my parents got a family plot. So the stone they threw my name on there because it's cheaper to get it done all at once.
Oh wow.
So my name's on there. I don't know if I'll ever go there, but in any event, my name is on there. So I'm not transgender, but if I were a transgender person in a situation like that, I might say you got to change the name on the stone. But in those instances, I'm pretty certain that the person would make sure the name was already changed on the stone before
Mhm.
they died, as long as it was possible, or before they agreed to be buried there.
Yeah, Angela mentioned an example of Angie Extravaganza. Her family honored her name, I guess her chosen name instead of her birth name.
Oh yeah, no, yeah, no. Most family, I would say most families of transgender people, if
Hmm.
they have control over the burial, most families would respect the transgender person's name. In many instances, if they weren't to be trusted, the transgender person would have given somebody else their power of attorney nowadays.
Hmm.
The
Yeah, that makes sense.
no say in the matter. We've had a lot of experience with that over the years.
That's a great question. This is from Hector Carrillo. How do you write about deceased ancestors you suspect were LGBTQ because of indirect indicators, but in the absence of documents or records that prove it?
They say he was a flaming queen. The answer is it totally depends. How much evidence do I have? Like my Uncle Arthur. I don't have a single record that says it, but based on my grandmother's reaction, there is no doubt that that man was a gay man.
Well, oral history is part of genealogy, right? So,
Exactly right. And even though she didn't say it, she didn't have to. But I
mhm,
also knew because of where he lived and the occupation he had, and it's all the evidence. So I'd say just like anything else in genealogy, you look at the evidence you've got, and if you feel you've proved your case, that's what you say. Um, I wouldn't say in the case of somebody, from like early records, like in the 19th century or earlier, I wouldn't necessarily say they were gay. I'd say they were what we would today call a gay man.
mhm,
Um, but and just to build on that a little bit, because it kind of ties in. I was I can't even remember what it was last year or the year before now. I was at the NGS conference in Richmond, and I was giving a different version of this talk.
mhm,
And um, I'm giving the talk, and unfortunately, there was an equipment malfunction, so I had no overheads. Giving this talk with no overheads was a challenge. Giving this talk at a National Genealogical Society conference with all the national speakers in the audience who are my friends. I don't know if any of you know Blaine Bettinger, but I was sitting up there and I finished talking. I said, any questions? And his hand shot right up. I was like, oh, I'm going to be in so much trouble. So I said, okay. But he asked a really good question, and I'll put it out here because it's related to this. And the question was, how do you handle people who say, you can't prove that? And and this was my response to him. And I left him speechless, which was awesome. It so rarely happens. I said, it's very easy. I'm a genealogist. I don't just make stuff up. I do research and prove my case. If I'm going to say I believe this person was what we today call LGBTQ, I believe I've got the evidence for it. So if somebody says to me, you can't prove it, I just look them in the eye and say, prove me wrong.
Yeah.
I don't have to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. I have to build the evidence and build the case, just like anybody else on any other fact. And many people who obviously are uncomfortable, we'll leave it at that. I'll use that word with LGBTQ people. Will say, they'll come right out and challenge me, and that's what I say. Prove me wrong. You're a genealogist. You have to come up with the evidence to say that my conclusion is incorrect.
That's true.
So don't don't be bullied.
Yes, for sure. Rebecca Haywood asks, for women, were there common terms in use for court records or other official records? She adds, typically it can be harder to find than for men, given that their sexual acts were not always criminalized.
Exactly right. That's just what I was going to say. It's actually harder to find court records for women because they were never prosecuted because there were no laws against women having sex together. It was only the men. They really just didn't, I mean, they cared so little about women in general.
Hmm.
It's really hard. It's harder to find those. Um, and I'm not aware of any specific terminology in those rare instances where there is something. Nothing that's immediately coming to my head. Um, of course, and then, we'll leave 10 minutes after I hang up. I'll come up with I'll come up with something. But there's nothing I can think of. Yeah, women really get the short shrift everywhere. So
Although in this case, I guess you could say it's
they
probably
look
for
out.
was in their favor, but yeah.
Well, no, it's true. Because I mean, here in we had what are called Boston marriages. The women,
Hmm.
in the 19th century, two women who got together and they lived together as wives, and nobody ever bothered them. Uh,
Hmm.
and it was all over the place, and they lived openly, and they're out and have to try. And they were from all socioeconomic levels, from the very wealthy to like average people. Um,
Yeah. Rebecca Haywood also says Lesbian Herstory Archives is one in
yeah.
Brooklyn, and the Center for Brooklyn History also has a lot of records related to queer history in Brooklyn. So,
Thank you so much.
yes, thank you for sharing that, Rebecca. Um, Lastly, I just have Angela Bell who said this is a wonderful Zoom presentation. Thank you. So,
Oh, I'm so glad you enjoyed it. I'm so glad you enjoyed it. It's fun. I enjoy giving this presentation. Obviously, I have ulterior motives, but yeah, I really do. So thank you. I'm glad you found it helpful.
do you have any final things to share about looking for the women um a- as opposed to the men?
I would say if I have to end on one note, I'm going to say this, and it's for both women and men and everyone, which is it's not enough to do the research. Please write their stories, tell their stories, and don't just include it in your genealogical research. Please, please, please donate these stories to your local historical societies and LGBT historical societies, but regular historical societies and libraries who have these collections. They would
Hmm.
love to have these stories to document the people who lived in their areas. And it's important that we do so. It's never been more important.
Yeah,
Not Magnus Hirschfeld has it been so critically important to make sure our stories are told. So please, and that's just something in general. I find genealogists, you're always waiting till you're finished.
right.
You're never going to be finished. I've never met a genealogist who ever finished their research. We are going to be doing this until the day we drop dead. I'm convinced I will have a pencil in my hand writing up genealogy stuff. And so it's important to just take a moment at whatever point, write the story, get it out there to folks. You can always go back and add to it and update it and do whatever, but it's important to get the stories told while you can.
Yeah, I wholeheartedly agree with that. They were, as you mentioned, so often written out of history, but
Yeah.
we can do our part to write them back in.
I have
Yeah.
the feeling you all might know one repository that might take a few. Just,
Yes,
just
good
saying.
point. Just saying. Yes, of course, the Center for Jewish History would be happy to have to collect any all sorts of stories from people across the broad spectrum of the Jewish experience. So yes, if that's something that you're thinking about, please consider donating your collection to the center. We appreciate that. And thank you, Michael, for the plug.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it. It's a pleasure.
Oh, you're most welcome. And have a good night, everyone at home, and good night, Michael. And thanks again so much for your valuable knowledge and advice to our audience tonight.
Very much my pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.